Thank you. Thank you, Lord Nicholas. It's a generous introduction, and I'm grateful for it. I also want to thank Klaus and Miriam and all of the board members of the Life Network for inviting me to be here in Malta. And I want to thank all of you for coming. So it's great to be speaking with you today. What I want to do is present our work and ideas, hopefully as clearly and quickly as possible, so that we have lots of time for questions and to have a shared conversation. The World Youth Alliance was started 16 years ago in New York at the United Nations during a Commission on Population and Development known as Cairo +5. At this UN conference, the UN brought in a small group of young people, 32, who were given the floor. These young people stood up and said, "We represent all 3 billion of the world's youth, and these are our demands as young people." They demanded abortion as a human right, sexual rights for children, and a deletion of parents' rights. At a conference on population and development, they had nothing to say about the needs facing most of the world's people, and certainly basic needs facing many populations, such as access to clean water, food, security, sanitation, education, housing, and healthcare. So I went into the UN the next morning with day-glow pink flyers that I had printed that night. These flyers basically said, these young people do not represent all 3 billion of the world's youth, and there are many of us who have a different worldview. This caused pandemonium. For 2 hours, the negotiations were stalled, and in that time, the world divided. The Western states huddled around the Clinton US delegation, and many of the developing nations came up to me and said, "Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for saying this." And they said, "You need to have a full-time presence at the UN and also come to our countries and work with our young people." So this was the beginning of the World Youth Alliance. But we faced a big question, which was exactly what are we doing? Here we can see all of these things that we're against. We can see many of these other things that we're for. But what is the central debate that's happening at the UN and within the culture that can focus what we need to do? We went back to the UN in 2000 for another important conference, Beijing +5, on women. At 3 o'clock in the morning, when all of the most important debates happen because the small states are exhausted and the translators have gone home, there was a very important moment where the United States offered a small oral amendment, and this was the proposal. It said, human rights grant human dignity. Again, human rights grant human dignity. And so we can take a vote. If you were the delegates at the UN that day and this proposal comes from the United States, are you in favor or against this amendment? Human rights grant human dignity. Those in favor?
It depends what rights.
So against. They are intrinsic.
Those against? Okay. Some abstentions.
I abstain.
So this was a crucial statement because what it showed us was actually a complete reversal of the Human Rights Project. The Human Rights Project is based on the fact and the commitment that the dignity of the person is the basis for human rights and the reason for them. We have human rights because we have this dignity of the person. So what this demonstrated to us was that there's a very sophisticated political philosophy at the heart of these debates, and we have to understand it, and that also every delegate at the UN understood it. This proposal failed, but it gave us the understanding of what's actually being debated at the UN. We saw in that moment that the fundamental debate at the United Nations is really a fundamental question about the human person. Is the human person a being with intrinsic dignity, which is then the subject of human rights? Or is the human being an object which can be used or discarded at will by nation states, which can be granted rights, can have those rights taken away, as governments and as states wish they want to do? And what we saw was that this was a very sophisticated way to continue to play out this debate that we have seen throughout the last 150 years. It's the question of whether the human person is prior to the state, or whether the state gets to determine who has human dignity and who does not, and the consequences that flow from that. From this moment on, we understood that the mission of the World Youth Alliance needed to be the defense of the dignity of the person. We recognized that this placed us at the heart of the human rights debates, and that it also gave us a language and a legitimacy to go into the UN and participate in these human rights questions by calling all of those present back to the founding reasons that these whole projects had moved forward. And it's worth noting in passing two things that are essential to understand in order to understand the human rights debate and the broader cultural debates that emerge in each of our own areas. The first is that human rights is such a ubiquitous term that we think of it as having a sort of good meaning and meaning many sorts of things of whatever we want. The reality is that human rights are technically legal instruments that bind nation states. This is something very important that we never discuss, but it means that human rights are legal obligations for countries and nations that they commit themselves to. This is why it is so dangerous to conceive of the idea that a state can determine who has human dignity, because what we're actually saying is that if human rights grant human dignity, then these member states have the right to decide who has human dignity and who does not. The second thing that's worth noting is that the modern human rights project is absolutely based on this fundamental question, because the modern human rights project really comes out of the Nuremberg trials. At Nuremberg, there was the huge legal question of what possible grounds do we have to try these people in front of us. Every German on trial at Nuremberg had followed the law, they'd followed the orders they'd received from their superiors, so how could they be tried in a legal court? Nuremberg said that there is known to every man, written so clearly in their hearts and in their minds, a law that supersedes positive law, that we can build a legal code around it. And it's so strong that we can build a legal code and we can commit people to follow it. So this access and knowledge to a reality about how we need to live and order our lives, about what we used to call the natural law, this is bound up in the entire International Human Rights Project as we know it today. Without our ability to establish this fact, the entire human rights project that we are in the process of undergoing falls apart. So what we saw at that moment was this sort of coming together of all of these things, where human rights have this background, they have this technical meaning, but they were being abused in order to push a very aggressive agenda by people of power. We were able to then begin from that moment to build our mission. We recognized that we could identify young people around the world who could commit to the dignity of the person. We could provide them with training and formation so that they could understand and articulate this idea and be able to present it to their peers, their schools, their communities, and their countries. Since that time, we've set up regional offices all around the world. We have a little map here. We now have 6 regional offices in New York City, Mexico City, Brussels, Nairobi, Manila, and our most recent office in Beirut for the Middle East. Each of these offices is run by full-time young people under the age of 30, which is the UN's broadest definition of youth. They work with young people in those regions to provide conferences, training, and opportunities for them to participate at national, regional, and then international negotiations, all of which affect the dignity of the person. We've learned that we can start from the starting point of the human person, and we can then figure out what our policy or our concrete response needs to be. And we've learned that if we start from any other starting point, we end up against the human person. Fundamentally, we only have these two options. Are we for the human person, or are we against the human person? But we have to do the work to be able to understand these ideas and understand the places we find them across the board. I want to also show something briefly, which is that since our Middle Eastern office has opened, our office is based in Beirut. It's about 2 years old. We received in November of last year one of 8 UN democracy grants. So this is giving us a grant from the UN now to train 620 young people in 5 countries of the Middle East in the principles of the World Youth Alliance. What this demonstrates is that the UN as well acknowledges in some way the validity of these ideas as the foundation for both human rights and democracy, and their partnership with us to allow us to do this is something very exciting. I want to move now into the advocacy work, and we can talk more about any specific questions you have. But what we have seen at the UN is that we consider policy to be a circle or a cycle. Most of the work that people do on policy focuses on drafting amendments, writing laws, making arguments, and that's very important. But policy, if it has any teeth, has funding attached to it, and funding is to enable programs that implement that policy on the ground. What you see in practice is that those that implement policies on the ground have a much stronger influence on developing those policies as they move forward. What we can see is that it is critical, if we want to influence policy, to engage this whole cycle. And if we're not engaging the whole cycle, policy battles become very defensive debates. We recognized this at the very beginning of the World Youth Alliance. As we went into the UN, we had all of these debates and all of these issues. There were brave and courageous people from many countries who were willing to stand up for many principles, and they often stood up and used up all of their political capital, and then were unable to do anything else. Because what they could not do was dig into the debate and try to push it in another direction. To push something in a new direction, you have to know what you want. And to know what you want, you have to be able to actually put that into action. I also want to suggest that the most effective groups globally do this. And we can see exactly how they do this, and it's helpful for us to learn from them. One of the most important groups that understands this policy cycle, and that I think is one of the most effective and influential organizations in the world, is the International Planned Parenthood Federation. You can start really on any part of this cycle wheel, but let's say we start at the level of policy. So here's a real-life example. In 1994, the International Conference on Population and Development was hosted in Cairo. The debate at this conference on population and development quickly moved to abortion. What became clear was that Cairo was a moment where many governments were attempting to take this international conference to create an international right to abortion. What do you think was the language that was most contentious at Cairo? Does anyone know? What's that?
Human rights.
Not human rights. More specific than that? What's this? More specific term.
Pro-choice?
No. So the big debate at Cairo was the term reproductive health. This was the new term that was introduced at Cairo. The question everybody had was, what does it mean? And of course, you have to define these terms in international documents for them to mean anything at all. The reason that reproductive health was such a debate and why everybody was so anxious to have this very, very clearly defined was because reproductive health was replacing another term that many governments refused to include or discuss anymore. Can you guess which term reproductive health replaced? Abortion? No. Sexual education? No. What else? Any other? Right to life? No. What could reproductive health replace?
Reproductive choice?
Not reproductive choice. Any other guesses?
The education of children by their parents.
No. Reproductive health replaced the term population control. So this was incredible for people because many countries who had been receiving international money and focus for population control went to Cairo to say, no more. We will not participate in this anymore. This is not helping our countries. It is not helping our people. So we won't have anything more to do with it. And so suddenly, the debate was about reproductive health. The great victory of Cairo was really...
Can I ask you a question? So they had rejected population control and they came up with the new terminology. Is it the same?
Reproductive health was the new term, yes, to discuss all the issues and terms that used to be discussed with population control. So heading into Cairo, the Holy See delegation saw very clearly that the fight was going to be, does reproductive health include abortion? Because if reproductive health included abortion, then we were moving very quickly to creating an international human right to abortion. So the big fight at Cairo was over the term reproductive health. All of the Western countries in the world were aligned on this. The United States was leading the charge. Cables went to every US mission in the world, so also to the US mission here in Malta, with instructions to the ambassadors to say the most important foreign policy goal of the United States is for your country to support us on these definitions, the inclusion of abortion as an international human right at Cairo. And the instructions said anything that needs to be done to secure this support needs to be done. So money, foreign aid, political pressure was applied all over the world. The ambassador of the United States to the Vatican received an additional message, which was that if you think this won't be well received, just don't bother to mention it. The Holy See knew exactly what was going on because they were getting irate messages from all over the world as this campaign began to move forward. And what happened at Cairo was something very amazing because although the entire wealth and power and money of the Western world was aligned together to achieve this goal, they did not achieve it. But here's what happens then if we ignore the policy goal. So in 1994 at Cairo, the great success of the Holy See and its allies, some allies in Latin America, in Africa, and a few other countries around the world, was that they determined that the term reproductive health does not include abortion, and that stands until today. International Planned Parenthood Federation said, fine, we lost that debate. So reproductive health is defined as not including abortion. Now what does this mean? Because it's in the document, billions of dollars for reproductive health programs all over the world are put in place, funded by USAID, the European Union, all of these groups for reproductive health. And International Planned Parenthood Federation is one of the key organizations that qualifies to receive that money and implement programs all over the world. So International Planned Parenthood Federation said, we got all this money now, we're running all these reproductive health programs, we're going to implement them on the ground all over the world. And by the way, the UN may not say that reproductive health includes abortion, but we do. So you have a sleight of hand where the policy is set, the funding is established, but one dominant organization controls all of the funding, and they de facto begin to implement the policy as if it includes abortion. And of course, over time, this creates policy problems for people because they say, what's happening in my country? I thought we agreed this wasn't happening, and now it is. I mention this because we think at the World Youth Alliance, this is the single most important thing we need to understand. If we want to stand for something, we have to be able to put it into action. So what we saw at the UN was that there are many, many issues that we work on that affect the dignity of the person. We do a lot of work on economic development, good governance versus population control. A lot of work on HIV and AIDS. A lot of work on maternal health, where people will say the focus needs to be safe abortion. You know, a lot of these issues where the dignity of the person is really at stake. But what we saw was that there were two issues that are central to these debates and two places where we did not have programs that we could showcase as best practices and move towards implementation. And these programs were programs focused on sexual education and women's reproductive health. When you take a look at UN language and commitments that governments have made, this is one of the fundamental principles that's enshrined and that all programs have to abide by. Everything we talk about in terms of sexuality and women's health is in this context of informed consent or informed choice. Informed choice, as the WHO defines it, means that women understand the choices that they're making as well as the consequences and that they choose them freely. This is applied then to the idea of unmet need. Informed choice and unmet need are the key drivers for women's health programming around the world. Unmet need, as the UN defines it, is any woman who is fertile and sexually active, not using a method of contraception, and not wanting any children. When you dig into how they codify that, it basically means that they're looking at every single fertile woman in the world, of fertile age, and they want to know, is she on contraception or not? So they come up with numbers such as 222 million women in the world have an unmet need for contraception. We might say, who cares what the UN thinks? Here's why we should care, because remember the policy wheel. If 222 million women have an unmet need for contraception, and we define this as meeting some of the goals in the areas funded by reproductive health, you have a very nice proposal now to submit to those funding agencies. Because maybe you say, my organization can meet that need for $3 per woman. And you multiply $3 times 222 million, and you start to see how these proposals get set up. What's important to note, however, is that we have to always go deeper. When you actually look at the reports that the UN itself puts out about unmet need, what you see is that the unmet need for contraception can never be met by contraception. The 222 million women that they see and can identify as not using contraception will not use it. Why not? The UN tells us. They've done all the research. They won't use it because it gives them health side effects that they don't want to deal with, or because they have religious or ethical concerns, or because it doesn't fit within their culture, or because their family has decided not to use it. What we can see then is that no amount of contraception meets the need these women have. But we can start to think maybe there are other ways we can meet the needs these women have to understand their health and their bodies and to achieve the goals that they may want to achieve. So it's very important to look closely at the data that the UN is using. They are often using very useful data, and they come to their own conclusions. We need to look into that data, and we need to see where assumptions are driving facts and not vice versa. So what we have developed are two programs, a women's health program and a sexual education program that meet the global demands, the political commitments that countries have made, while accomplishing our ability to work within this policy wheel. The Fem Program is our women's health program, and we have four aspects. We educate women about their bodies and their health. We teach them this concept of hormonal health versus hormonal suppression. We give them support with a FEMM app that's being developed so it can help them to understand and interpret the data that they see. We're developing a healthcare and a clinic model that can implement this type of healthcare, and we've developed a series of medical protocols to take care of the different difficulties that they have. So I want to run through this very briefly so you can see how we've developed this program and how it relates to all of these needs. FEMM starts with the premise that hormones control most of women's health, her reproductive health and her health, and we want those hormones to be healthy and not suppressed. So we have to understand that there are four major hormones, two from the brain, two produced in her ovaries. We can see this graph here. So we have the first hormone coming from the brain. It stimulates this low rise. That begins to lead to this slope of estrogen. We need to see that upward activity that leads to high levels of estrogen. If those high levels are present, the second hormone comes from the brain. It causes ovulation. The rupture takes place. And then that empty follicle produces progesterone. What's very important to note here is that if we don't get to high levels of estrogen, we can't have ovulation. If we don't have ovulation, there is no production of progesterone. So who cares, and why does this matter? It matters because estrogen and progesterone influence everything in a woman's body. Estrogen is necessary to her bone tissue formation, her muscle formation, her blood circulation, all of the activities that are happening in a continual way, such as the renewal of her brain cells and the balancing of her moods. If estrogen is imbalanced, we have difficulties in each of these areas. Progesterone relaxes and maintains all these same body systems. So we neither want continual stimulation nor continual relaxation. She needs the right levels at the right time for her body and her health to function. If those hormones are off, if she has hormonal abnormalities, she will have all of these types of symptoms, and she'll experience additional things like acne, mood swings, depression, weight gain. All of these things are signs of hormonal abnormalities. And as a result, in the US, we know, and it may be similar in Europe, that 1/3 of the women in the US are on the pill to manage gynecological problems. They're prescribed contraception to help manage all of these symptoms of hormonal disturbances. So here's what we can see. We want to see this activity of hormonal sufficiency taking place. If it's not taking place, the woman has symptoms, she has these imbalances. But here, when we take a look at the pill or other hormonal contraceptive forms, what we're doing in a way is putting a big blanket of high dosage hormones onto her hormones, which has the benefit in many instances of alleviating the symptoms that she is experiencing, but it doesn't identify or treat the underlying imbalances that she has initially. So by teaching this to women, they can understand the importance of their health. They can be taught to monitor these hormonal signs. The FEMM app is in development as a way to help them do that and provide women-specific feedback to them about what they're observing. This is an image of our pilot clinic in Columbus, Ohio, where we're testing and providing this type of outreach, particularly to young college women. It's across the street from Ohio State University, which is one of the largest state universities with 70,000 students. And then what we're able to do is provide them with the medical protocols. So the key thing here is obviously, number one, identifying my hormonal activity. And number two, if it's irregular, we want to correct that. We don't want to just manage those symptoms. And that is what we have teamed up with a whole research crew of doctors in forming the Reproductive Health Research Institute to develop standardized protocols that can allow us to treat all of the reasons that a woman might need support. I'm going to briefly show you what that looks like. Every single one of these hormones is necessary for ovulatory function. You can see how complex this process is, how easy it is for something to go wrong. And so what the protocols allow us to do is it gives us an algorithm for every single hormone, for every single level, so that the doctor can very easily identify whether the hormonal imbalance is the cause or whether there's something else and rule it out. And that allows us to move very quickly to treatment. So this is our proposal, that if we want to be able to influence these policy debates about women's health, we have to have a way that we can propose a new solution. And we think the solution has to be better and more effective. If we can provide better and more effective answers to the needs that people have, we think that they'll be very excited to move forward. Very briefly now, I just want to outline our sexual education curriculum. Again, first, what is the problem and why do we need a new approach? This is a very long definition. It's the WHO definition of sexuality. I've highlighted some of these things, which you can read. Sexuality encompasses sex, gender identities and roles, sexual orientation, eroticism, pleasure, intimacy, attitudes, beliefs. It's a very expansive definition. And remember, what we're talking about is how do we define sexuality in order to lock in sexual rights. And what this fundamentally believes, which we always forget, sexual rights are goods that states deliver to their people. I think there's an argument to be made that we don't want the state delivering almost any of these things to us. But ideas have consequences, and with that understanding of human sexuality, the WHO has developed a matrix of goals and objectives that they think should be achieved in teaching sexual education to students. These are some of the ideas that they indicate for ages 0 to 4. These are not grades or forms. These are ages. So if you think about all the 2- and 3-year-olds that you know, this is what the WHO suggests they need to be taught with curriculum sponsored at the state level. I think it's easy enough to read. As you get to age 4 to 6, we expand already. We're already teaching them the basics of human reproduction, the idea of unrequited love, crushes, friendship and love. This is a lot of information to be teaching 4- and 6-year-olds. And by the time they're 6 to 9, we introduce contraception, sexual language, sexual intercourse, etc. I think that it's easy for researchers and bureaucrats to sit in an office and look at research and produce this kind of documentation and have goodwill towards all men. But if you actually think about taking these ideas and talking to a 3 or a 4 or a 5-year-old in front of you about them, I think it becomes a very different question. And you can see that this type of information for those ages of children is not empowerment, but is actually opening them up to ideas and concepts that make them very, very vulnerable. So this is something that we have to be able to understand, and it begs the question, what can we do? What type of sexual education, meeting these broad UN goals, could be even possible for these young ages that have to start at age 3 or 4 or 5? What we realized as we went back through this is that when you look at a lot of these concepts and think about them for a long time, what you realize is most of these are not biology. Most of these are not facts about how we are. Most of this is about personal identity and a global worldview. Most of this, in other words, is anthropology. It's a vision of who the human person is and how we interact with each other. Once we realize that, we could start to do our own research. Research shows us that programs that teach a very clear vision of personal identity and worldview are highly effective. And if we can teach an anthropology that's rooted in the dignity of the person, that teaches them an understanding of who they are as subjects and not objects, we see some astounding numbers that once we get from kindergarten through high school are giving us very high success rates in accomplishing 2 things that go together: delay of sexual debut and educational attainment. We know that the longer someone delays sexual debut, the higher level of educational attainment we can start to expect. This is not surprising because both of these successes are rooted in a very healthy and strong sense of personal identity. And that's what we need to nurture, and that gives us an anthropological basis for building a new approach. The World Youth Alliance has now developed the Human Dignity Curriculum. We tested this in St. Lucia in the Caribbean. We're now taking it to Mexico City and New York City for more extensive testing and evaluation. But what we can see is that effective aspects for the transmission of these ideas start first with a strong anthropology. They engage families, religious leaders, and civic leaders in these conversations and programs, and they give a sense of the transcendent and spiritual nature of the human being into these conversations. The curriculum themes that we've developed work through these ideas at every single grade. We have 7 hours of instruction at each level on the dignity of the person, the powers of living beings. Freedom is in gray because it comes in at a later age, as does this concept of subject and object. Intentional and non-intentional action, self-determination, and habits for human excellence frame how we think of this at every grade level. Our very initial results are showing us that this approach works and that it's the anthropology that's doing the work for us. At age-appropriate levels, we do have to introduce to young people how their bodies work, how they integrate their sexuality into rightly ordered friendships, how they should think about marriage and commitment. But at the early ages, it's understanding who they are that does the work of protecting them and setting the expectations they have for the kinds of behaviors they'll adopt in their lives. Another thing that we can see is that a big project of this curriculum is setting the moral imagination. And this is something the children love, because when you talk to the 8 and 9 and 10-year-olds that we've spoken to, what comes clear from them is this idea of wonder at big ideas. They've said to us things like, "Do you think I can really be excellent?" And the fact that an adult thinks they can accomplish human excellence sets their moral imagination. It sets the trajectory and the distance that they think they can travel. And that's absolutely what we want to do at these young and exciting ages. Here's an outline of what grade 8 looks like thematically to just start to apply all of these things. And then we have lesson plans, a curriculum. We're developing online supplements for parents and teachers so they can work together in order to really implement and bring this to schools. So our proposal is really that the dignity of the person is both the basis and foundation for how we can build free societies, that if we respect and understand the dignity of the person and build programs in conformity with the human person, that they will succeed, and that at the moment we're facing a desperate need and a challenge to, in particular, develop programs for sexual education and women's reproductive health that are rooted in a correct and authentic understanding of the dignity of the person. And that if we can start to implement these kinds of programs, we think we can shift both the culture and the policy debates in very positive ways. Thank you very much.